I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the thing people don't understand when they hear this story. They imagine I was some kind of chosen warrior, some deliberate placement. They picture a ceremony, a briefing, a handshake between species. They think someone decided that a human being would stand in the Velkin throne room on the day of the Sovereignty Accord signing, and that it was all very planned, very official. It wasn't. I was there because Corporal Yevgenia Marsh had a stomach bug. That's it, that's the whole reason. She ate something from the commissary on Way Station, Delvrose, 2 nights before the ceremony. Spent the morning of the most important diplomatic event in interstellar history with her head over a recycler bin, and her commanding officer, a captain named Reeves who had exactly 1 spare body to throw at the situation, looked down his roster, pointed at my name, and said, "Vasquez. You're fluent in Vale ceremonial protocol." I said, "I've read the briefing files, sir." He said, "Good enough." And that was how Specialist Dario Vasquez, 31 years old, from a mid-sized city in the state of New Mexico, a man who had been in the Interstellar Liaison Corps for exactly 14 months, ended up standing in full ceremonial dress inside the Great Hall of House Velkin on the morning of the 22nd of March, 2387. I want to get that part right before I tell you the rest, because when people hear what happened, and a lot of people have heard what happened by now, they assume I was brave by design. They assume I was trained for it. They assume that somewhere in my past, there was a moment where I decided I was the kind of person who would throw myself between a galactic enforcement cannon and a royal heir. I wasn't. I was the kind of person who stayed home on weekends. I liked cooking. I kept a small collection of old paper books. I called my mother every Sunday and told her I was fine even when I wasn't. I was, by every measure anyone had ever applied to me, entirely ordinary. I want you to remember that. Let me tell you about the Velkin, because if you don't know them, the rest of this doesn't make any sense. They are not like us. I know everyone says that when they talk about alien species, but I mean it in a specific way. The Velkin are not different from humans the way, say, a wolf is different from a house cat, same basic category, different scale and temperament. They are different the way water is different from stone. They share a biosphere, technically. They breathe something adjacent to oxygen. They have bilateral symmetry, but the comparison ends somewhere around the cellular level. They are tall. The shortest adult Velkin I encountered during my 14 months with the Liaison Corps was roughly 2.5 meters. Most of them were closer to 3. They have 4 arms, articulated at double-jointed shoulders that allow nearly full spherical rotation. Their faces are broad and flat, almost mask-like, with 3 horizontal bands of what look like black visor glass, photoreceptive organs arranged in a row where a human's eyes, nose, and mouth would be. They communicate in a layered language that uses sound, color, their skin shifts in chromatic patterns that carry grammatical and emotional information, and a subauditory vibration that humans can feel in the sternum but can't consciously process. When a Velkin is pleased with you, the skin across their upper arm shifts to a deep, slow gold. When they are afraid, they go pale, almost white, almost translucent, so you can see the darker structures beneath. When they are about to fight, they go red. I learned all of this in the briefing files. Seeing it in person is different. The files don't tell you about the smell, something like ozone and cedar, and something else I've never been able to name, sharp and clean and very, very old. They don't tell you about the sound the floor makes when a Velkin walks, this deep resonance that you feel through the soles of your boots. They don't tell you how it feels to be human-sized in a room built for beings 3 times your height, in a chamber where the ceiling is 30 meters up, and the columns are each the diameter of a freight elevator, and the light comes from strips of bioluminescent material that pulse very slowly, like breathing. The Great Hall of House Velkin breathed around you. That's the only way I can describe it. We arrived 6 hours before the ceremony. There were 4 of us from the human side of the delegation, myself, 2 senior diplomatic attachés named Cowrie and Fentress, and Ambassador Celeste Ortega, who had been working toward this moment for 11 years, and who radiated a kind of focused, terrifying calm that I found simultaneously reassuring and unnerving. The Velkin side had approximately 60 people in the hall when we entered. Some of them were household staff, identifiable by the pale gray draping they wore, a single length of material wrapped from shoulder to floor in a specific pattern that indicated their role. Some of them were members of the Royal Guard. I want to spend a moment on the Royal Guard because they matter. The Valekin Royal Guard, formally, the Verathsul, which translates loosely as something between the unbroken wall and those who do not move, are not simply soldiers. The distinction is important, and it's one I didn't fully understand until I was standing in the same room as them. A Valekin soldier fights. A soldier's purpose is to engage an enemy and overcome that enemy through force. A member of the Verathsul does not fight in that sense. Their purpose is singular, to interpose themselves between a threat and the royal body. That's it. Full stop. They are trained not for offense, but for absorption. They are trained to receive damage. They wear armor layered in a specific configuration that maximizes protective coverage over vulnerable areas. Not their own vulnerable areas, but the probable vulnerable areas of whoever is standing directly behind them. Every element of their training, every instinct they develop over decades of service, is oriented around one axis. Something is coming, and I am between it and the person I protect. There were 12 of them in the hall when we arrived. They stood at regular intervals along the walls, unmoving, arms folded in a formal posture that I learned later was called the Vethrana, the resting guard position. They were the largest Valekin I had seen. Their skin was a deep, even gray that didn't shift the way the staff's did. I assumed at first that this was a product of their particular biology, or maybe a cosmetic thing, a deliberate uniformity of appearance. I learned later that Verathsul members undergo a conditioning process that suppresses the chromatic emotional display. They train themselves, over years, to feel nothing strongly enough to show it on their skin. It's considered one of the most difficult aspects of the initiation. Some candidates never manage it. Some manage it and then can't undo it. They leave the guard and spend the rest of their lives in a kind of emotional flatline, pale and still, their bodies no longer capable of the language they were born to speak. The one closest to the central dais was named Kethvar. I didn't know his name at the time. I learned it later from the official record. In the moment, he was simply the largest being I had ever stood near, 4 meters tall if he was an inch, with arms that could have wrapped around my entire torso twice over, standing at the right-hand base of the steps that led up to the throne platform, perfectly motionless, staring at nothing. I remember thinking, I wonder what it's like to be built like that and told your only job is to stand still. I had no idea at that point what I was about to learn about standing still. The ceremony was supposed to take 4 hours. I'm going to walk you through the setup because the setup matters. The Great Hall was configured for the accord signing in a specific way. The throne, the actual seat of the sovereign, a structure that was more architectural installation than furniture, carved from a single piece of what appeared to be black volcanic stone, with veins of something that glowed faint blue, sat elevated on a 3-tiered dais at the far end of the hall. The dais steps ran from floor level up to a platform roughly 2 meters above the main floor. The throne itself was not occupied during the ceremony. This was a deliberate protocol decision. The Valekin sovereign did not attend treaty signings personally. It was considered too exposed a position, too vulnerable a display of the royal person. Instead, the ceremony was presided over by the royal heir, His Serene Highness Vershan Kavale, the sovereign's eldest child, who would stand on the second tier of the dais and oversee the signing. Vershan was young. By Valekin standards, a species whose natural lifespan runs somewhere between 2 and 3 centuries, he was very young. He was perhaps 60 of their years old, which put him somewhere in the adolescent young adult range, and this was reflected in the relative slimness of his build compared to the adults in the hall. And in a certain quality, his chromatic display had a kind of looseness, like someone who hadn't fully learned to control their expressions yet. He stood on the second tier dressed in the deep violet and silver of House Valekin's royal colors, and he was vibrating with what I can only describe as barely contained excitement. His skin kept flashing these brief, warm amber pulses, the Valekin equivalent, I remembered from the briefing files, of a smile, and then going deliberately neutral as he apparently remembered where he was and tried to compose himself. I liked him immediately. I don't know why. Maybe because he reminded me of someone nervous at their first important job, trying very hard not to let it show. Ambassador Ortega and the Valekin State Minister went through the preliminary proceedings, a formal greeting exchange that took 40 minutes and involved a great deal of color shifting from the Valekin side, and a great deal of careful, measured ceremonial language from Ortega, who had clearly drilled this specific sequence until she could have delivered it in her sleep. Attachés Cowrie and Fentress were positioned to the left of the central walkway, near the diplomatic table. I was positioned, per Corporal Marsh's original assignment, which I was simply filling, at the base of the dais stairs to the left side. My role was functionally ornamental. I was there to represent human presence in the ceremonial space. I was to stand still, observe, and under no circumstances do anything that might disrupt the proceedings. Standing still, observing, not disrupting things. Two of these things I managed just fine. It was during the second hour of the proceedings, the covenant reading, a long sequence in which the terms of the accord were formally read aloud in both languages, that I first noticed something wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not alarm bells wrong, just off. There were galleries above the main floor, wide, arched balconies that ran along 3 walls of the hall. They were occupied by Velkin dignitaries and observers, seated in rows on curved benches. There must have been 300-400 beings up there, all of them watching the ceremony below. At the start of the ceremony, they had been still, attentive. The Velkin have a specific stillness when they're engaged in something serious, a quality of absolute focus that you can almost feel as a physical thing, like a held breath. Somewhere in the second hour, I became aware that one section of the left gallery had become slightly less still. I couldn't have told you in that moment what exactly I was noticing. It wasn't movement, precisely. It was more like the quality of the stillness had changed in that section. Like the difference between someone standing still because they're watching something and someone standing still because they're waiting for something. I told myself I was imagining it. I was new, I was nervous. I had been standing in ceremonial dress for 2 hours and my feet were aching, and my brain was probably manufacturing problems to stay occupied. I kept watching. The Velkin do not have a concept exactly equivalent to what humans call terrorism. They have something adjacent, a political and philosophical tradition of violent contestation that they call the Vethara, the challenge breaking, a practice that in earlier centuries was a formalized mechanism for disputing royal succession. In those days, it was ritualized and bounded by very specific rules about who could challenge, and when, and under what circumstances. In the modern era, the last 400 years or so, the Vethara had been officially abolished. It existed now only as a fringe ideology practiced by splinter groups who believed that the current House Velkin line was illegitimate, that the sovereignty had been obtained through treachery some centuries back, and that the true royal line had been extinguished. These groups were not large. They were not, by most intelligence estimates, particularly well organized. They were, it turned out, organized enough. I didn't know any of this in the moment. I didn't know about the Vethara. I didn't know about the faction called the Solvarath, which translates, with grim irony given the name of the Royal Guard, as those who do not rest. I didn't know that intelligence services on both the Velkin side and the human side had flagged a potential threat to the accord signing, and had increased security from the standard 12 Verathsel to 24, 16 of whom were positioned in the galleries. I didn't know that the 8 beings I was watching in the left gallery had passed their concealed weapons through by bribing a low-level access gate official 3 weeks earlier. I just knew that something was wrong. The sound came first, not an explosion, not a bang, but a deep, resonant crack like a massive piece of ice breaking, and then a flash of white-blue light from the left gallery so intense it left afterimages even when I squeezed my eyes shut. Then 2 more in quick succession. The hall filled with a sound I can only describe as a scream made of machinery, the tearing shriek of a galactic enforcement cannon firing, a weapon I had read about in security briefings but never encountered in person. A GE cannon, in case you don't know, is not a bullet weapon. It fires a directed electromagnetic pulse that, in its focused mode, can disrupt the electrical activity of a biological nervous system within a radius of roughly 6 meters. In its wide-beam mode, it can clear a room. In its focused mode, pointed at a specific target, it can drop a being, any being, regardless of size, instantly. There were 3 of them, fired in sequence, at the dais. Everything happened very fast, and I have tried, over the many times I've been asked to recount this, to be honest about what I actually remember versus what I have reconstructed from the evidence afterward. What I actually remember: the light, the sound, my head turning toward the dais. Vershin, the young prince who had been standing on the second tier, hands clasped, still trying to maintain his ceremonial composure, had taken a step backward. Just one. The automatic recoil of a young being whose nervous system registered danger before his mind did. That one step had taken him out of the protective shadow of the two Varathsel positioned on the second tier and put him briefly, probably for less than 2 seconds, exposed. Out of the established protective geometry. The Solvarath shooters in the gallery had clearly planned for exactly this. The first blast was likely designed to create confusion and drive the prince backward. The second and third were aimed. The two Varathsel on the second tier moved. They were already moving when I saw them, these massive, disciplined bodies snapping from the Vethrana stillness into motion with a speed that was genuinely shocking for their size, pivoting to close the gap the prince's step had opened. They were going to make it. I'm almost certain they were going to make it. Except the second blast hit the left side Varathsel member in the upper arm, a glancing shot, not centered, but enough. His body registered the electromagnetic disruption and he went down heavily, and in going down he collided with his partner, and for a single moment, a fraction of a second, a window that should not have existed but did, there was a gap. The prince was directly behind that gap. The third blast was already in the air. I did not decide to move. I want to be absolutely clear about this. There was no decision. There was no moment of weighing options or calculating outcomes or thinking about anything at all. My brain had simply not been consulted. My body read the geometry, gap, prince, incoming, and moved. I don't remember crossing the distance. I don't remember climbing the dais steps. I know from the hall's recording that it took me approximately 1.3 seconds from the moment the second Varathsel went down to the moment I was on the second tier, because the hall's security system timestamps everything. 1.3 seconds. What I remember is the impact. A GE cannon blast in focused mode, hitting an adult human nervous system. I've been asked to describe it. I've tried several times. The best I've managed is this. Imagine every circuit breaker in a building tripping simultaneously. Not an explosion. Not pain in the way pain normally works, not heat or pressure or tearing. It's subtraction. Every signal in your body, every electrical impulse that maintains the ongoing conversation between your brain and your limbs and your organs and your skin, suddenly gone. Not interrupted. Gone. Like a light being switched off. I was conscious for approximately 2 seconds after the impact. In those 2 seconds, I was aware of the following things in this order. The floor of the dais, very close to my face. The sound of the hall, which had gone from the mechanical shriek of the cannon fire to something I can only describe as a held breath. Thousands of beings, all of them suddenly silent. The Prince Vershin, directly behind me. I was aware of his presence the way you're aware of a warm light source, this sense of heat and color, and a specific quality of stillness that was different from his ceremonial stillness. This was the stillness of shock. His skin in those 2 seconds went white. Not pale, white. The full expression of fear in Velkin biology, every chromatic cell in his body reading the same signal, the deepest alarm his species is capable of displaying. He was looking at me. I was on my knees by then. My body was performing the process of collapsing in what felt like very slow motion, joint by joint, the signals that normally manage upright posture simply absent. I was aware of this happening and found I had no particular feelings about it. The 2 seconds of consciousness I had left were very quiet. I remember thinking, absurdly, about whether I'd left the burner on in my quarters on Delvrose. Then I was out. I was told later that the rest of the incident lasted approximately 11 minutes from the moment I went down to the moment the Solvarath team in the gallery was contained. The 16 additional Varathsel who had been positioned throughout the gallery moved in the same moment I was hit. I didn't see this. I was unconscious on the dais floor. But from the accounts I was given and the recordings I watched later, it was, and I say this with full awareness of how strange the word sounds, beautiful. The way the guard moved. All 16 of them, all at once, from positions distributed across the gallery space, converging on the 8 Solvarath shooters in a coordinated collapse that took exactly 9 seconds and resulted in 0 Velkin civilian casualties. 9 seconds. Vershin was placed behind the full protective formation on the dais within 4 seconds of me going down, guarded by 6 Verathsol members who had arrived from secondary positions throughout the hall. Ambassador Ortega, from what she told me afterward, had the presence of mind to remain absolutely still at the diplomatic table and not run, which she said was the hardest thing she'd ever done in 30 years of diplomatic service. The Solvarath team was contained. 3 of the 8 resisted containment. These 3 were alive when the incident was over. The other 5 had, in the Verathsol's assessment, made the choice not to be. No one else was seriously hurt. The Veilkin who had been hit by the glancing shot in the upper arm recovered fully. His name, I learned later, was Venash, and he had been a member of the Verathsol for 32 years. He is still serving. I was unconscious for 9 hours. When I woke up, I was in the House Veilkin Medical Facility, which was the most disconcerting environment I have ever regained consciousness in. The room was enormous, sized for Veilkin patients, and the bed I was in was correspondingly enormous, so that I was lying at the center of this vast flat surface that stretched away in every direction like a pale landscape. The ceiling was very far up, the light pulsed very slowly. The first thing I registered was that someone was sitting near me. I turned my head slowly, because my neck felt like it had been replaced with wet concrete, and looked. It was Vershin. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the bed, which put him at approximately eye level with me given the height of the mattress. He was in informal clothes now, not the ceremonial violet and silver. His skin was doing something I hadn't seen before, a slow, deep, pulsing blue that came and went in waves across his upper chest and face. I learned later that this coloring is called the Vethsalin. There isn't a precise human word for it. It sits somewhere between grief and gratitude, and something else that the Veilkin consider private enough that they typically suppress it in the presence of non-family members. Some translators render it as debt sorrow. Others call it the feeling of knowing what you owe and understanding you cannot repay it. He was looking at me. I looked back at him. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then in carefully phrased standard, accented, slightly formal, clearly prepared, he said, "You are awake." I said, "Yeah." My voice came out rougher than I expected. "Sorry about the ceremony." He stared at me. I watched his skin go through about 4 colors in rapid succession. Surprise, confusion, something golden, then amusement. A young being trying to process a very strange human reaction to a very extreme situation. He said, "You are sorry about the ceremony." Seemed like an important day. I probably caused a disruption. He was quiet for a moment, then the gold deepened. "You are unusual," he said. "I've been told that. Here is what happened in the hours and days after I woke up, condensed as best I can." Ambassador Ortega came and held my hand without saying anything for about 3 minutes, and then recovered her composure and briefed me on the official situation. The incident was being treated as a contained security failure. The accord signing had been suspended, but not abandoned. The Solvarath team would be processed through Veilkin judicial proceedings. The human delegation was being offered accommodation in the House Veilkin complex for as long as required. I asked if I was in trouble. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said, "Not exactly." The Veilkin state minister came to visit me on the second day. He was approximately 80 years old, silver-skinned, with a formality of bearing that was almost architectural. He sat in the chair beside my bed, a chair that had been brought in specifically, I was told, because the standard ones were not human scale, and he spoke to me for 40 minutes about the nature of the Verathsol tradition and the specific language the Veilkin had for actions that fall within the conceptual territory of what the Guard does. There is a word, Vethkaran. It doesn't translate cleanly. The root Veth relates to the concept of protective interposition, literally, the act of placing yourself in the space between. Karen is a modifier that indicates that the action was performed outside of formal duty, not as a trained guardian fulfilling their sworn function, but as an individual acting from something the Veilkin consider philosophically distinct, something more. The state minister used this word about what I had done. I told him I hadn't really done anything, I just moved. He was quiet for a moment, then he said in careful standard, "This is what makes it the Vethkaran." I didn't fully understand that at the time. I've thought about it a lot since. On the third day, the sovereign held audience. I was told about this the evening before Ambassador Ortega, pacing slightly, explaining the protocol. The sovereign of House Velkin had formally requested a private audience with the human specialist who had been on the dais. This was, she told me, without any direct precedent in the 4 decades of human-Velkin diplomatic relations. The sovereign did not hold private audiences with non-Velkin citizens. The sovereign did not hold private audiences with beings who were not heads of state or equivalently ranked diplomatic officials. The sovereign certainly did not hold private audiences with specialists who were 14 months into their first posting. "What do I do?" I asked. Ortega handed me a 14-page briefing document on sovereign audience protocol. I read it twice. In the morning, I was escorted by 6 Verathsel members through corridors I hadn't seen before deeper into the house complex, where the ceilings were lower, by which I mean they were merely 20 meters up instead of 30, and the light came from panels rather than the bioluminescent strips, and the walls were lined with something that looked like carved stone but had a warmth to it, almost like wood. That I later learned was a material cultivated from a specific mineral that the Velkin harvest and season over centuries. The audience chamber was smaller than the Great Hall by a significant margin. It was still overwhelming by any human standard, perhaps 30 meters by 30, with a single raised platform at one end, and a pool of what appeared to be water on the floor in the center, smooth and still, reflecting the light from above. The sovereign was already on the platform when I entered. I won't try to describe them in great detail, partly because I was told afterward that detailed physical descriptions of the sovereign's person are considered discourteous in Velkin culture, and partly because, honestly, my brain was doing several things at once in that room, and precise descriptive observation was not one of them. What I can tell you is that they were old. I don't mean old the way we say it about people. I mean genuinely, visibly, beautifully old, the way an old tree is old, or the way deep water is old. A presence that had simply existed for a very long time and had become denser for it. Their chromatic display was slow, very slow, colors moving across their skin like clouds moving across a sky, visible only if you watched for long enough to catch the shift. I performed the protocol, the formal greeting posture, the specific angle of inclination, the gesture sequence Ambassador Ortega had drilled me on for 2 hours the previous afternoon. The sovereign watched this. Then they spoke. Their standard was fluent and deeply accented, each word given a weight that I'm not sure standard usually carries. They said, "We understand you were not supposed to be in the hall." I said, "No, Sovereign. I was a replacement. Corporal Marsh was ill." A pause, then, "And yet." "And yet," I agreed. Another pause, longer. "The Verathsel have a tradition," the Sovereign said. "When a member of the Guard performs an act of exceptional distinction, an act that exceeds the expectation of their function, they are brought before the Sovereign and a formal acknowledgement is made. We have performed this tradition for 900 years. I said nothing. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to say. "You are not Verathsel," the Sovereign continued. "You are not Velkin. You are not bound by oath or function or centuries of training. You had no formal reason to be on that dais. No duty assigned you to that position. No training prepared you to respond to what was occurring." They paused, "And yet you placed yourself in the space between." I still didn't know what to say, so I said the thing that was most true, which was, I didn't really think about it. The Sovereign looked at me for a long time. Their skin went, very slowly, to gold. What followed is difficult to describe accurately, because I was not entirely tracking events in the way I normally would. My nervous system was still recovering from the GE blast. I had been told by the medical team that full neurological recovery from a direct hit would take approximately 6 weeks, and there was a quality to my cognition that I would describe as slightly underwater. Things moved a little slower. I processed a little later. I registered that the door behind me had opened. I registered the sound of the hall filling. I turned. The audience chamber, which had been empty when I entered, was now not empty. Velkin beings were filing through the doors at the far end, household staff, officials, members of what I recognized as the Sovereign's personal court, attendants. And along the walls, the Verathsel, all 24 of them in full formal armor, moving to their stations with that specific quality of silence that the guard carried everywhere they went. And behind them the broader household, some of the faces I recognized from the Great Hall, some I didn't. And there, at the center of the approaching group, Version. In formal dress again, violet and silver. Standing very straight, trying very hard to compose his chromatic display and mostly managing it, though the warm amber kept pulsing through. I stood there in the center of the audience chamber, this human-sized person in the middle of a space built for giants, in a room that was filling rapidly with beings who could each have put their hand around my entire torso. And I had the absurd, acute, entirely inappropriate thought. I should have worn a better uniform. The sovereign spoke again, and this time their voice carried in a different way, not the directed, private quality of the conversation we'd been having, but the resonant projection of formal address, meant to fill a room. What they said took about 4 minutes to say. I caught maybe 60% of it, partly because my standard was good but my Velkin was poor, and some of what the sovereign said shifted into ceremonial Velkin partway through. What I understood was this. The sovereign was speaking about the Vethkaren, the act of protective interposition performed outside of formal duty. They were placing it in a specific historical and philosophical context, referencing its original definition, its significance in Velkin culture, the weight the concept carried. And then they were applying that definition to what I had done. Not as a metaphor, not as a courtesy, as a formal, legal, philosophical determination. The act I had performed on the second tier of the dais was being formally designated as the Vethkaren. I had placed myself in the space between. And in Velkin tradition, 900 years of tradition, there was a specific response to the Vethkaren. Kethvar moved first. The largest Verathsol member, the one I'd noticed at the base of the dais steps, the one I'd thought about in the idle way you think about things before everything goes wrong, stepped forward from his position along the wall. He crossed the floor toward me in measured strides that each covered roughly 2 of my steps, and he stopped at a distance that was close enough to be within arm's reach if he chose to extend one of his 4 arms. He looked down at me. I looked up at him. I have tried since to find words for the expression on his face, which is imprecise, since Velkin faces don't work the way human faces do, and what I was reading was partly chromatic, partly structural, partly something I absorbed without fully understanding. But if I had to name what I saw, I would say it was recognition. Not familiarity, we had never spoken, never interacted. But recognition in the sense of seeing something in someone else that you know, that your whole body knows, that you have practiced and rehearsed and built your life around. He recognized what I had done. He inclined his head. A Verathsol member inclines their head to no one except the sovereign and the royal heir. He inclined his head to me. And then, slowly, that specific terrible slowness that made it feel like watching a building make a decision, he lowered himself to one knee. 3 meters of armored Velkin guardian, kneeling, on the floor of the audience chamber with his head bowed. The hall made a sound, not a sound exactly, more the absence of a sound, like every being in the room had forgotten how to breathe. And then, one by one, the other 23 members of the Verathsol did the same. Then the court officials. Then the household members. Then Version, and I saw him do it. Saw the Prince of House Velkin go to one knee in the ceremonial posture that I recognized from the briefing documents as the deepest formal acknowledgement one person can make to another in Velkin culture. The posture reserved, according to every document I had ever read, for royalty addressing royalty. He lowered his head. I stood in the center of the audience chamber. Every being in the room, hundreds of them kneeling. And I, a 31-year-old specialist from New Mexico who had been there because someone else had a stomach bug, standing upright in the middle of all of them, not knowing what to do with my hands. I cried. I want to put that in here because I think it matters, and I think it would be dishonest to omit it. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in a way I even fully registered in the moment. I was aware at some point that my vision had gone very blurry and that there was something happening with my face, and I identified it intellectually as crying the way you might identify weather from behind glass. It felt very far away. But I cried. Because here is what I understood, standing there. I had not been brave. I had not been strategic. I had not been anything. I had moved 1.3 seconds before my brain caught up with my body. In response to a geometry my nervous system read faster than my conscious mind could. And the result had been that a 60-year-old royal heir was alive, and I had spent 9 hours unconscious on a dais floor in a foreign star system. And none of that was, the word brave is wrong, it's too small, it's too. I'm not making this part up, and I'm not being modest. I genuinely did not experience what I did as brave. I experienced it as automatic. The same way you experience pulling your hand back from a hot surface. The same way you experience throwing your arms out when you stumble on stairs. Your body does something before you can choose to do it. But here is what I understood, looking at 3 meters of Veilchen Guardian kneeling on the floor. He had spent his entire life choosing, every day, to be the kind of person who would do what my body had done automatically. He had chosen it, every training session, every year of conditioning. Every decade of standing still in the Vethrana posture, while his body learned to suppress its own emotions, so that the single function of interposition could remain pure and unobstructed. He had chosen it so thoroughly and so completely that it had become him. And he was kneeling to me. Not because I was brave. Because I had done, accidentally, what he had dedicated his whole existence to being capable of doing deliberately. And in the Veilchen philosophy, in the framework that had produced the Verathsel and the concept of the Vethkaran, the act was the same regardless of what produced it, the space between, the body placed between the threat and the protected, the outcome, the prince alive. He wasn't kneeling to me because I was special. He was kneeling to the act. And the act, for a moment, had lived in me. The ceremony was rescheduled for 2 weeks later. I was not supposed to be there for it. I was supposed to have returned to Waystation Delvros while Ambassador Ordega and the diplomatic team completed the signing. This was the protocol. This was the plan. Vershin formally requested, through the correct diplomatic channels, that I attend. The request was unusual enough that it had to go up 2 levels of the Liaison Corps command structure before someone decided they were comfortable approving it. They approved it. I stood at the base of the dais steps for the second ceremony. Not on the dais, this time, not in an elevated position, just at the base of the steps. And I watched Ambassador Ordega and the Veilchen State Minister sign the Sovereignty Accord. I watched Vershin preside over the signing with considerably better composure than he'd managed the first time. The warm amber of pleased excitement subdued now under a quality of gravity that he wore more naturally, as if the preceding 2 weeks had done something to him. He caught me watching him at one point, and his skin did that amber pulse just once quickly, and then he composed himself again. I looked away so he didn't have to. At the reception afterward, a long, flowing Veilchen social event that I navigated with the help of a Taché Fentress, who turned out to speak passable conversational Veilchen, and was very kind about guiding me away from anything I might accidentally find offensive. Kethvar appeared beside me. Just materialized the way the Verathsel tended to do. One moment he wasn't there. The next moment 4 meters of Guardian was standing at my side. I looked up at him. He looked down at me. He said in Veilchen, and Fentress translated quietly at my elbow, "You stood in the space." I said I did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Fentress took a moment longer to translate, clearly looking for the right words. What he said was, "The space does not know if you chose it. The space only knows you were there." I thought about that for a long time. I'm still thinking about it. I've told this story a number of times now, more than I ever expected to. The official account is in the Liaison Corps record, and there's a diplomatic notation in the Sovereignty Accord documents, and the incident is now apparently part of the standard training curriculum for human diplomatic personnel serving in Veilchen space, under the heading, Contextual Security Response. People ask me different things when they hear it. They ask if I was scared. They ask if I'd do it again. They ask what it felt like to have an entire room full of beings kneel for you. The question I remember most was from a journalist, a young woman, sharp and direct, who asked me something that nobody else had asked. She said, "Did you understand in those 1.3 seconds what you were doing?" I said no. She said, "Would it have changed anything if you had?" I thought about it for a while, a real while. long enough that she started to look like she thought I hadn't heard her. I said, I hope not. She nodded slowly, like that was the answer she'd been expecting. Because if you'd understood, she said, and done it anyway, that would be a different kind of person than you are. I think about that too. I think about Kethvar, who understood, who had always understood, who had built his entire life around the understanding, and still went to one knee on the floor of the audience chamber for a human specialist who had simply moved fast enough. Two different kinds of courage. Same space. Same body placed between. And maybe, if you believe the Veilkan philosophy, which I find myself increasingly inclined to do, the same act. The space does not know if you chose it. The space only knows you were there.